The blame game against American guns just hit a new low, and the Supreme Court is about to send a loud and clear message to the world. Don't mess with the Second Amendment. Let's be real. This is nothing more than political theater. The Mexican government knows it can't win, but it's hoping to shift the blame for their failures onto us. In this video, we're breaking down how the Supreme Court's decision on this case could slam the door on these ridiculous lawsuits once and for all, expose Mexico's empty posturing, and protect American gun manufacturers from becoming global scapegoats. Trust me, this is a case every gun owner needs to pay attention to. Mexico's blame game against American gun manufacturers targets not only Smith & Wesson, but also companies like Glock, Colt, and Ruger. They claim firearms legally sold in the U.S. are smuggled across the border through straw purchases, ultimately arming cartel thugs. It's plain common sense that these manufacturers don't sell weapons to criminals. Yes, they may occasionally cozy up to anti-2A politicians, but that's about the extent of their questionable decisions. Their goal is straightforward: to produce firearms for profit, not to arm dangerous individuals. This lawsuit is as ridiculous as holding Ford accountable for the actions of a drunk driver. At the center of this debacle is the PLCAA, which stands for Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, a 2005 law designed to shield gun makers from lawsuits blaming them for the criminal misuse of their products. It ensures manufacturers aren't held liable for crimes committed by bad actors. After all, it's not the tool committing the crime, it's the person using it. Mexico isn't exactly breaking new ground with this lawsuit. Cities like Chicago and New York have tried similar moves in the past, suing gun manufacturers to hold them accountable for crimes committed with their products. But time and time again, these cases have been thrown out, thanks to the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. This law protects gun makers from being blamed when their firearms are misused by criminals. One big exception, though, came after the tragic 2012 Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. The shooter used a Bushmaster XM15E2S rifle to kill 26 people, including 20 children. Families of the victims sued Remington Arms, the rifle's manufacturer, claiming its marketing promoted the weapon for military-style attacks, violating Connecticut's Unfair Trade Practices Act. In a rare move, the Connecticut Supreme Court allowed the case to go forward, focusing on how the gun was marketed rather than its production. By 2022, Remington settled with the families for $73 million, a huge shift from the typical immunity the PLCAA provides, affirming that the PLCAA protects manufacturers from becoming scapegoats for societal issues. But again, that's about the only exception. And let's not pretend this is about justice. The Mexican government knows this case is destined for failure in U.S. courts, yet they persist. Why? Because this isn't about stopping cartels or illegal gun trafficking. It's about creating the illusion of action. By targeting Smith & Wesson, Colt, Ruger, and others, Mexico hopes to convince the world and its citizens that it's taking meaningful steps to address a crisis spiraling out of control. The Mexican government's failure to curb cartel power is no secret, and corruption runs deep within its institutions. Law enforcement is outgunned, outmaneuvered, and often compromised. Cartels thrive not because of American gun manufacturers, but because Mexico has failed to enforce the rule of law. Drug lords operate with impunity, controlling entire regions, while officials either collude with them or turn a blind eye. This lawsuit conveniently ignores Mexico's inability to regulate arms trafficking or dismantle the networks enabling cartel operations. And instead of addressing these glaring issues, Mexico shifts blame northward. Their simpleton's narrative is laughable. Without U.S. guns, cartels wouldn't have weapons. Cartel guns are smuggled illegally, often through weak border enforcement that Mexico has done little to strengthen. The lawsuit's premise glosses over the fact that these weapons change hands multiple times before ending up in cartel arsenals. What's even more infuriating is that Mexico's citizens can see through this charade. Many understand their government is more focused on appearances than real action. While officials blame American companies, communities in cartel-dominated regions endure constant threats that require more urgent actions. Extortion, kidnapping, and violence are everyday realities, yet their leaders spend millions on lawsuits that won't change a thing. This is partly because American gun culture has always been an international punching bag. To many outside the United States, the Second Amendment isn't seen as a cornerstone of freedom, but as an outdated relic causing chaos. From Europe to Canada, countries with strict gun control policies frame American gun ownership as reckless. What they fail to understand is the cultural and historical significance of gun rights in the U.S. While they congratulate themselves on disarming their citizens, Americans know an armed populace is a safeguard against tyranny and a defense of individual freedom. The hypocrisy is astounding. Take the UK, where knife crime rates have climbed in the face of stringent gun control laws, yet they portray themselves as moral authorities. Canada, under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, vilifies U.S. gun laws while implementing bans and buybacks that punish law-abiding gun owners for crimes committed by others. These nations claim their policies reduce violence, conveniently ignoring their own rising rates of stabbings, assaults, and gang-related crime. The logic of blaming U.S. gun manufacturers is paper-thin. Smith & Wesson, Glock, and Ruger sell firearms legally within U.S. laws. They aren't shipping crates of weapons to Mexico. Guns smuggled into cartel hands result from illegal trafficking networks exploiting weak border enforcement. Yet the Mexican government sells the story that American gun makers operate without oversight. The truth? Gun making is one of the most heavily regulated industries in America. This narrative conveniently glosses over the real culprits, criminal networks, and corrupt officials enabling smuggling operations. Mexico's failure to combat these issues is well documented, but its leaders would rather sue U.S. companies than fix the structural rot allowing cartels to thrive. If Mexico's government were serious about fixing things, they could follow El Salvador's lead in addressing their own decades-old problems with organized crime. Under President Nayib Bukele, El Salvador has undergone a dramatic transformation, turning a nation once notorious for rampant gang violence into one of the safest countries in the region. This didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't without controversy, but the results are undeniable. Bukele implemented a no-nonsense approach to crime. His government launched massive crackdowns on gangs, deploying tens of thousands of soldiers and police to seize control of gang-controlled neighborhoods. He pushed for sweeping reforms, building one of the largest prisons in the world to hold suspected gang members, many of whom were arrested en masse during states of emergency. Videos of this effort, showing lines of tattooed gang members being detained, have gone viral, symbolizing the extent of Bukele's hardline policies. Today, El Salvador has seen a historic drop in homicides and violent crimes. Streets once ruled by fear are now bustling with life, and the country is beginning to attract tourists and investors once again. If Mexico's government showed the same level of resolve in dealing with cartels, by tackling corruption, securing neighborhoods, and dismantling criminal networks, they could achieve similar results. But instead of adopting proven strategies like these, Mexico is wasting resources on frivolous lawsuits against American gun manufacturers, all while its real problems persist. Then there are countries like Canada that criminalized guns while attacking America's gun culture. Virtue signalers too busy with their virtue signaling that they can't be bothered to deal with real problems. It's easier to point fingers at guns than to address rising crime or broken systems at home. But international critics won't stop there. They're hoping to use this lawsuit to reshape the conversation around American accountability and global firearm regulations. This is where the Supreme Court's ruling will deliver a dose of reality. This lawsuit is already dead on arrival, and the Supreme Court is ready to put the final nail in the coffin. Mexico's case doesn't stand a chance. Let's talk about the PLCAA for a second. Enacted in 2005, the PLCAA protects firearm manufacturers from being held liable for crimes committed with their products. It's rooted in common sense. You don't sue a hammer company because someone used their tool to commit a crime. The Supreme Court is almost certain to side with Smith & Wesson and the other manufacturers. The PLCAA has been tested and upheld repeatedly. Mexico's claims don't just lack merit. They blatantly contradict decades of precedent. Even if activist judges wanted to push this case forward, the Supreme Court isn't about to rewrite the law to accommodate frivolous lawsuits. This ruling will reinforce the PLCAA and serve as a warning against future attempts to hold gun makers accountable for crimes they didn't commit. A favorable ruling would have far-reaching consequences. If the Supreme Court throws out Mexico's case, it will send a clear message to other nations eyeing similar litigation. Don't bother. Without this decision, what's stopping Brazil, Canada, or any other country from attempting the same stunt? The PLCAA exists for a reason, and the Supreme Court is about to remind the world it's not up for debate. This decision could finally give gun manufacturers the breathing room they deserve. Companies like Smith & Wesson and Ruger have spent millions defending themselves from baseless accusations. Imagine running a business while constantly under fire for problems you didn't create, all because foreign governments can't control their borders or enforce their laws. But this case isn't just about lawsuits. It's about the broader implications for the Second Amendment. The Supreme Court's decision could cement legal protections for manufacturers while reinforcing the principle that individual freedoms, including the right to bear arms, are not negotiable. This ruling will matter for the Second Amendment, but the real story here is whether it will force Mexico and others to confront their own failures instead of blaming American gun makers for their shortcomings. A Supreme Court ruling in favor of U.S. gun manufacturers won't just be a win. It'll be a declaration that the Second Amendment is non-negotiable. This case is about more than protecting companies like Smith & Wesson, Ruger, or Glock from frivolous lawsuits. It's about reinforcing the idea that law-abiding businesses cannot and should not be held responsible for the criminal actions of third parties. That's the entire purpose of the PLCAA. A decisive ruling will strengthen this legal safeguard, ensuring gun rights remain protected from backdoor attempts to weaken them through endless litigation. For 2A supporters, the implications are monumental. A victory here would go beyond the courtroom. It would reaffirm that firearms manufacturing is a legitimate and essential part of American freedom. Anti-gun activists don't just want legislation restricting gun ownership. They want to financially cripple the companies that make them. A ruling in favor of gun manufacturers would slam the brakes on this underhanded strategy, preserving not only the industry, but also the rights of individual gun owners across the country. Internationally, the fallout could be seismic. Anti-gun countries like Canada, the UK, and Australia routinely criticize America's gun culture, while ignoring their own growing violent crime problems. UK is even banning certain types of cutting equipment because knife violence just keeps climbing. A Supreme Court ruling against Mexico's lawsuit would be a sharp rebuke to their narrative. These nations love to hold up the U.S. as a cautionary tale, blaming its gun laws for global violence. When the Supreme Court dismisses this case, it'll highlight just how shallow those arguments really are. But the criticism will keep coming. Nations with strict gun control policies will frame this ruling as a rejection of their worldview. They've spent years painting the Second Amendment as a cultural flaw, an export of chaos and violence. A favorable ruling for U.S. manufacturers will remind them that American freedoms don't require their approval. The Supreme Court ruling will resonate far beyond the Second Amendment. It'll call out nations like Mexico to face their real problems instead of scapegoating American gun makers. Mexico's problems with cartel violence have nothing to do with American gun manufacturers and everything to do with its own failure to address corruption and lawlessness. Corruption in Mexico isn't just a problem, it's an institution. Police forces are outgunned and often bought off by the same cartels they're supposed to combat. Politicians turn a blind eye, cozying up to criminal leaders instead of confronting them. Lawsuits against companies like Smith and Wesson and Glock are nothing more than desperate attempts to distract from decades of governance failures. Cartels didn't rise to power because of straw purchases in the U.S. They rose because Mexico allowed them to. Entire regions are controlled by drug lords, with local governments either complicit or paralyzed by fear. Instead of addressing this reality, Mexico blames American gun manufacturers, hoping lawsuits and media campaigns will shift the narrative. The real culprits, corrupt officials and weak enforcement, continue to thrive in the shadows. Mexicans must elect a strong and incorruptible conservative leader like Nayib Bukele to address its systemic corruption, enforce its laws, and dismantle cartel power structures. Suing American companies won't achieve any of that. It's a shiny object waved to avoid the hard work of fixing what's broken. The U.S. has a role here, but it's not to be a scapegoat. Border security and coordinated efforts to disrupt cartel operations are key, but the primary responsibility lies with Mexico. Until they face their failures, cartel violence will persist, no matter how many lawsuits they file. And that's it for this video. The blame game against American gun manufacturers, fueled by Mexico's misguided lawsuit, is nothing more than a diversion from the country's systemic failures. Why do you think Mexico is doing? What impact do you think a Supreme Court ruling in favor of American gun manufacturers will have on the global conversation about the Second Amendment? Drop your thoughts in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this breakdown, give us a like, share it with fellow supporters of the Second Amendment, and don't forget to subscribe. Hit that bell icon to stay in the loop on all our latest updates.